Uh, I didn't have a bio on you. Vaughn was on his cruise, so you might tell us a little about yourself or whatever you want to do.
Okay, so we're ready to start.
Yeah, go ahead. It's all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Vaughn, for inviting me. And this kind of reminds me when my wife and I prepared our first
Our first
apologetics course
apologetics course
in our
in
church,
our church.
and
And
we got all set up on the Thursday night they gave us, and we wondered if anybody was going to show up. So, and fortunately they did, but it's good to see so many of you here. You guys are a regular group. How long have you been getting together?
gosh, probably close to 10 years. And
Wow,
it's at least 10. It's at least 10. And uh, so once a month.
once a month. Okay, great, great. And I understand that not everybody's a Christian. You've got some of our non-Christian friends in the group as well.
As far as I know tonight, those two fellows did not show up. I don't
Okay.
know, but only the Lord knows all of our hearts. So
Yeah.
we can,
Yeah. Well, I found it very interesting and encouraging to hear that you had some non-Christians in your group, and that's wonderful, actually, I think.
right.
Yeah. Well, what I'd like to do this evening is share with you what I'm calling my journey to apologetics and even ministry, which is something that's happened really over the last 12 or 15 years. And there's a whole story behind that. And so I guess in this, there's a little bit of a personal testimony, but there may be more about it that would be of value to you concerning particularly witnessing and evangelizing from an apologetic perspective. So hopefully those two things will come out. Like any good pastor, I could probably break out the talk into three parts. The first one, I'll give you a little bit of background and I'll tell you a little bit about myself, at least that's relevant to this journey. And the two initial driving forces behind my discovery and ministry in apologetics. One is centered around my older boy's walk away from his faith and his sudden disclosure that he did not believe in God. And then I'll share with you a little bit of my intellectual discomfort with my faith. And that was both of those things together were a driving force. That led to a series of God things that led me to discover apologetics and then actually get formally educated in, initially at the Denver Seminary, and then I finished up at Biola University in the Talbot School of Theology. So I got some formal education in it. And then all of this has turned into an application, and that is in terms of my ministry and my engagement with my non-believing son. So hopefully that's of interest and maybe some use to you guys.
Yep.
So a little bit about me. Um, I'm married, been married for 43 years, close to 44 here in less than 2 months. Um, and I've got two sons. And let me show you a couple pictures. Okay, are you looking at a slide, Apologetics on Mission?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So that's me and my wife. I have to admit that that picture is about 10 years old. So as you can see probably from my face on the screen, I don't look quite as young. But I will tell you, my wife is just as beautiful as she was 10 years ago. I met my wife in Korea. I've had a dual career in the military, overlapping with a science/engineering career at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. And I'll explain that here shortly. But I met her after my first assignment as a young second lieutenant in Korea. And she followed me over to the United States. And we've been together, obviously, ever since. Uh, her heart is as beautiful as her face. Got two sons. This is my older boy, and this is the one I'm going to be talking about, and my daughter-in-law. and my granddaughter. So this was last Easter, given all the pink and the rabbit ears. Um, and then here is my younger son, and he is married to a young lady who was born in Argentina. And I won't talk so much about his walk with faith, but he's a guy that probably has not committed his life to the Lord, but boy, does he ask a lot of questions. And we have great discussions. Less so on this side, but we're all on a journey, and my two sons are on their own journeys. And as long as I'm a part of it, then I need to thank the Lord for that. But in terms of my faith, I've been a Christian as long as I can remember. Um, I grew up in a family that realistically probably was held a nominal faith. We went to church every week, but I don't recall the Bible ever being opened at home, and very, very few discussions at home concerning our faith. Um, as a result of that, my two sisters later in life, I say as a result of that, I think a combination of things, but probably a weak basis for their faith, they've since walked away from their beliefs, and I'm the only one in the family, including my wife, that are probably still Christians, and that's probably only because the Holy Spirit would not let me go. But I was part. I grew up in what increasingly became a liberal church. My wife and I got married in that church, but over time, I would say that my theology was not all that deep. Um, I was beginning to dig into what I truly believed, but it became to the realization that that church was walking away from biblical teaching and the true revelation of our Lord. And we ended up leaving that church, and that was part of my search overall. I remember asking myself later in life why I was a member of that church. And of course, the answer was I grew up in it, but that's not a sufficient answer. And I think the Lord was tugging at my sleeve saying, okay, why is it that you're a part of this church? What do you believe, and why do you really believe it? And so when we walked away from that particular denomination, the search began, and my faith began to significantly grow. But we raised our two boys in the church. But as I share a little bit of my career with you, there was a lot of family disruption because of my career. And I think that had certainly a certain amount of influence on my son's view of religion and view of God in particular, because frankly, Dad was not around. So a little bit about my career. I'm a West Point graduate, so I was obligated to go active component, active duty, and I did that for 13 years. Um, my first assignment was in Korea. My second assignment was in the Mojave Desert, where this was still during the Cold War. I graduated from West Point in 1979. So the Cold War was still underway, and at Fort Irwin, California, I wore a Russian uniform for 3.5 years, and we were the opposing force for all of the U.S. units that would rotate in there, and we would hold desert-like battles. It was wonderful training for what later turned out to be the first Gulf War. But following that, I went off. Army sent me to graduate school, went to West Point and taught in the math department for 3 years, and then worked in a classified acquisition project office. Um, the next there were two significant events in my career. One is the collapse of the Soviet Union and essentially the end of the Cold War. And that changed the whole nature of the military. Congress, as always, whenever a war ends, Congress draws down the military rapidly, and there was no exception. And so I opted, with some financial incentives, to leave the active Army, become a reservist, and that's when I went to work at Los Alamos Lab. Now, as a reservist throughout the 90s, I would teach summer school math at West Point. That was part of my reserve duty, and then I would also recruit for West Point in the state of New Mexico. So in the reserves, if you want to get credit for a good year towards retirement, you've got to do a certain number of things. And I was basically doing the minimum stuff as I was focusing on my career at Los Alamos. Now, I am not a nuclear physicist. You're all well aware that Los Alamos is a primary design laboratory for the U.S. and nuclear weapons. Uh, my background in both what the Army calls operations research and also in industrial engineering, my job at the laboratory was to build decision analysis models for the Department of Defense, for the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation. And these models were basically a combination of applied math, statistics, and computer simulation. And so we would simulate what we would call socio-technical systems. In other words, they weren't pure physics-based systems that we were simulating. They had a human component to it. And that was necessary because high-level decision makers were going to use these tools to help them make decisions about certain issues. So it was a challenging but an exciting time. So I did that through the 90s. The second international event that came about that changed my whole career focus once again was 9/11. And 9/11 occurred when I was 44 years old, thinking at the time that there was no way that I would be called up as a 44-year-old guy who had not been on active duty or been with troops in quite some time, only to discover that I suddenly stumbled across uh, mobilization orders with a 3-day notice. Was called up rapidly after 9/11. And that kicked off the next 12 years of basically a rotating door between working at the laboratory and going back on active duty. So 5 different times for a total of 7.5 years, I served on active duty in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in the Pentagon and various other places. Now, I say all that because when 9/11 occurred, my oldest boy was 15 years old. The younger guy was 10. So here he was in the prime, so to speak, of his teenage years. And frankly, he was struggling with typical teenage issues and disciplinary issues and whatnot. The problem was that starting at 15 years old, dad disappeared for the most part, or would come home for a short period of time before he'd disappear again. And so those are formative years. And he was going to public school, and as we all know, there's certainly not much of a or any of a religious component to public school. So when it was not being reinforced at home, at least my wife was doing as much as she could, but he was resisting. So that's sort of the basis of where he was at, and I'll share with you how that's all come out to play since then. So those are my careers, both the military and the laboratory. I ended up retiring from the military in 2013, went back to the laboratory again and retired from the laboratory in 2015. So 2013 Army, 2015 the laboratory, and uh, and then my journey in apologetics really accelerated because suddenly I had time on my hands, not having to balance 2 careers. And then my son made his proclamation, which I had to I knew I had to address. And so really what I'm going to describe for you is my post-military and post-career experiences. So um, one year, this was about a year before I retired from the military, my son came to visit with us for Christmas, as he always did. And I said to him, "Well, Byron, we've got Christmas Eve service to go to." His name is Byron. And I said, "We have Christmas Eve service to go to this evening." And his face suddenly changed, and it was clear that he had gathered the courage to look me in the eye and say, "Dad, I don't believe in God, and I'm not going to church. I don't go to church anymore." So certainly it was a surprise to me at the moment, but looking back, I'm not so sure my son ever really embraced his faith. He had to be involved in the church and church activities and whatnot because dad made him do it, but he never owned it himself. And so, really looking back, it shouldn't have been a surprise. But for me, my response was one of, yeah, initially surprise, but as you might imagine, guilt, because I immediately thought, okay, where did I fail? Where and how did I fail to share my faith, fail to tell him who Jesus is and why the biblical worldview is true? But rather than put the blame on him, or put a lot of disappointment in him, the disappointment was mostly on me. And it led to this introspection. And the questions that I was asking, well, first, what does he believe? If he doesn't believe in God, in the Christian God, then he must believe in something. But before I thought I could really dig into that, I needed to step back and say, okay, what do I believe and why do I believe it? And I mentioned earlier that there was this intellectual discomfort in my own faith. And what I mean by that is that while I've been a Christian my entire life, I often say that it's because I've always felt the presence of the Lord. And one way of putting that, it was a heart thing. Now, maybe that meant that from early on, before I even knew it, the Holy Spirit had regenerated me. Perhaps, certainly has at some point. But from a mind perspective, I just had difficulty not articulating my faith to a non-believer, for example, but justifying it and explaining why the Christian worldview must be true. Frankly, I struggled with that. And frankly, I wasn't getting anything out of church to explain that. And I didn't know anything about apologetics. So what I did was here when I retired from the Army and was still working at the lab, I sat down with a young pastor at my church and I said, please help me. Let's dig into the Bible. And this young man, here I am, the old man. I'm, old man. So I was probably around 58 or 60 years old at the time, and he's in his late 20s or early 30s, and he's just out of seminary. And so we met every Friday at lunch for a year, and we went through the Bible, and I learned a lot from him. Not apologetics, that never came up, and I still didn't know about it, but I was digging into my faith. As any good apologist has got a deep understanding of the Bible, and so that's really what I was doing at that point. As I'm meeting with this young pastor, there was an adult education class ongoing at my church, believe it or not, on systematic theology, and they were using Wayne Grudem's book on systematic theology, a very thick book, and some of you may be familiar with it. It's been around for quite a while. But the book is so thick that I think there are more than 50 chapters. And because there's so many chapters, Grudem put the references at the end of every chapter, not at the end of the book. So there's hundreds, if not 1,000 references in this book. But God apparently wanted me to read one particular book out of those hundreds. I don't remember how I found it. I guess I know why I found it because the Lord wanted me to read it. But it's a book called The Universe Next Door. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this book. It's on its sixth edition. It's been around for more than 30 years, written by a Christian philosopher named James Sire, called A Basic Worldview Catalog. And maybe what got my attention initially was this unique or very interesting title. But basically, this book is um, is a worldview book, and chapter one talks about what is a worldview and why does a worldview matter, and what are the basic, what I call big life questions that a worldview must answer to be a reasonable or plausible worldview. And then every succeeding chapter is an examination of a particular worldview. For example, starts with theism, moves to deism, eventually hits naturalism or atheism, and pantheism and others. And as I'm reading this book, and I didn't have a very good philosophical background, so when I would see words like ontological or epistemological, those were words that I had to get the dictionary out and read. So I struggled a little bit as I worked through this book. But what I saw And what I got out of that book was a huge eye opener for me. Because in my opinion, if somebody could read that book from an unbiased, objective perspective, if that's even possible for any of us to do that, but if you could read that book objectively, you could not help walk away thinking to yourself, not only is Christian theism plausible, it is by far the most plausible explanation for this world, for reality around us. And the way the author did that was he took these big life questions and attempted to answer these big life questions from each of the worldview's perspectives. And as you got further and further in the book, probably intentionally the way he ordered these worldviews, you got further and further away from the biblical worldview. And as you examine these worldviews, you could see in many cases that their responses were incoherent, they were inconsistent with one another, and in some cases, some of these worldviews couldn't even answer some of these big life questions. So this was huge to me because this was really my introduction to apologetics. Now, worldviews is just one part of apologetics. Certainly, as you all know, there's the science part of apologetics as well. But this was big to me because what I was doing was number one, trying to satisfy my intellectual concerns about my faith, but I was also searching for a way to talk to my son because he had walked away. I still didn't know why he had walked away, but I also knew that he had some real serious objections and some hostility there too, that he would have to get over if he was ever going to come back to the Lord. And I was looking for a way to talk to him because, frankly, if I were to ever mention one of four words, he didn't really want to talk about faith. If I mentioned God or Jesus or gospel or the Bible, he didn't want to talk. It was like the wall went up. But as I'm reading this book, I'm thinking to myself, gee, maybe this is a way to have a discussion with him. All right, so I retire from the laboratory, we move up to Colorado. I decide, and again, I don't really know what apologetics is. I guess I'm beginning to get some hints, but I'm thinking maybe I want to get a degree in theology. Again, not knowing what apologetics is. So we get up here to Colorado Springs. I go online, discover that there's a seminary up the road, the Denver Seminary, about 50 miles. And this was the summer of 2015. So the academic year was not yet about to start. But as I went online and looked at the Denver Seminary, they were offering a course open to the public, meets once a week for 8 weeks or something like that, costs $15, and it said it's about worldviews. And I click on the link, and guess what book they're using? They're using The Universe Next Door. So I kind of laugh and I'm thinking, Lord, apparently you want me to dig into this book some more. So I signed up for the course and took it. And it turned out that the head of the apologetics department was running the course. He talked to me about apologetics and I enrolled in the master's program, and that's where all started. So I'm taking apologetics, being introduced to it, and I'm discovering that there is this thing called apologetics, and it's in fact a branch of theology. And I'm thinking to myself, how come I never heard of it? If this is a branch of theology, why at 50 or 60 years old, I'm suddenly discovering something that none of my pastors have even talked about? That, as it says here, offers a rational defense for the truthfulness and the divine origin and authority of Christianity. So that's the first thing I learned. Then I learned that there is this firm biblical basis for apologetics. You know, certainly probably the most cited apologetics verse, as you all would know, 1 Peter 3:15. But I underline a couple of things here. Always be prepared to give a reason. So um, there are many Christians who know nothing about apologetics, but I've even run across more than a few that object to apologetics for various reasons. Can't argue somebody into the faith and various other things. But the way Peter tells us about always being prepared, that is essentially a command. That's an imperative. a command to defend our faith, be able to give a reason for the hope that's in you. And so here was probably the basic biblical underpinnings of apologetics. And I'll just mention one other, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Paul in Acts and in Athens. And this is one I've actually given sermons on and given many classes on. But as you know, when Paul went to Athens, first thing he did, like he always did, he'd walk into the synagogue and he'd be talking to Jews. And the Jewish worldview and the emerging Christian worldview were obviously both theistic, very close. They both agreed on who God was. They both believed in the authority of Scripture as it existed at the time, the Torah. Um, and so when Paul reasoned with them, he was defending, telling them that Christ was in fact the Messiah. But he had this whole biblical scriptural basis and shared worldview to be able to reason with them, as opposed to when he was invited up on Mars Hill to speak to the Greek intellectuals. And Luke tells us, in fact, tells us what the world views of these guys were, Epicureans and Stoicists. And while those two worldviews don't exist today, Epicureanism is essentially materialism. Now, while they had gods that they worshiped, the gods were materialist, were material, basically. So it was, maybe the beginning of atheism. Stoicism has a lot of, is closely related to early versions of pantheism. So I say that because what this particular passage taught me, and this ended up being very relevant to my son and my discussions with him, was that Paul changed his entire approach, his evangelical, his witnessing approach when he walked up the hill. These guys did not, they had very different worldviews. They didn't know what scripture was. They didn't know anything about it. And as a result, Paul never even cited scripture. Instead, he cited some of the poets and of their own culture. And he did that because he knew that they would understand that. And of course, he had to, connect that to his whole discussion. He never mentioned Jesus' name. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, there's a message there. And the message is that certainly at one level, it certainly would be helpful to understand what somebody's worldview is before perhaps you launch into sharing your faith. And of course, I'm immediately connecting that with my son. Okay, so I'm thinking, okay, what is my son's worldview? Getting back to, so all of this is part of my introductory course. There's a whole history behind apologetics. John Montgomery, some of you may be familiar with him. He's no longer with us, but he was both a lawyer and a Christian apologist. He lays out 7 episodes of the church, 7 errors, if you will, of the church from an apologetic perspective, and talks about the apologetic challenges to the faith in each of those 7 errors and who the apologists were that stood up and defended the church in a way that was required at the time. The breadth of apologetics, and this is where my intellectual inclinations were being satisfied, discovering that you could see God in general revelation, specifically in science, in mathematics, in history, in philosophy, in archaeology, and in worldviews, that in fact you could go beyond the scriptural verses like in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Well, what is scripture telling us? That you can see God in his creation. But apologetics was showing me specifically how you could do that, not in just general terms, but in areas that non-believers would potentially listen to you if you could talk about your faith in those areas. And then, of course, Romans 1:19 to 20, for what can be known about God is plain to them, being non-Christians, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. So it's interesting that here are 2 passages, Psalm 19 and Romans 1, that come from scripture, from special revelation, and they point to the evidence and revelation of God in general revelation. Now, looking back over my church upbringing and church experiences, there was very little discussion of God in general revelation. It was all about scripture, which of course is critically important. But, as I teach, I often, tell people that, if you're ever asked why you're a Christian, oftentimes people will say something like, well, I believe the Bible. Well, okay, well, that's certainly a good reason to be a Christian, but a non-believer could then turn to you and say, well, I don't believe the Bible. I believe there's errors and contradictions and it's a bunch of myths, and I don't believe the Bible. Well, what's your choice at that point? Either to make a case for the credibility and reliability of the Bible, or to talk about your faith outside special revelation, in terms of general revelation, in terms of those areas, science, math, history, so on, that they might immediately have interest in and can relate to their view of the world. So this is all, again, apologetics is just my eyes are just opening. And again, I'm just amazed thinking, why didn't I know about this? Now, maybe if I had, I'm thinking that I might have brought my son up in a different way in terms of faith, and there would have been a huge apologetic component to his upbringing, which perhaps maybe he'd be in a different place today if we had done that. Now, when we teach this stuff in my ministry, we get to the point where we actually offer up a class on something called the apologetics of Jesus. Now, it's no wonder that if apologetics is a legitimate branch of theology, that Jesus ought to have something to do with apologetics. And perhaps many of you already know, but I certainly discovered that once I began to examine logical arguments and evidential approaches, and then went back and read what Jesus said and how he responded to the Pharisees and others, it was amazing. Like he was a brilliant apologist, the best apologist that there's ever been. And this book, $15 book, paperback, is something that I actually stumbled across after I completed my degree. Norman Geisler, very well known, respected apologist who died a few years ago, co-authored it with Patrick Zuckeron, who was a student of his and has since got his PhD, and he's an apologist out in Hawaii. And he actually joined with us on teaching a course on the apologetics of Jesus in our ministry. So here I am learning about apologetics, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, this really tells me that there's this huge mind intellectual component to the faith. And apologetics, in fact, some might describe it as the intellectual component of theology. The why behind the what is what our ministry often refers to it as. What is it that you believe, and why do you believe it? And apologetics can help answer the why part. But it also led me back to Scripture. And of course, we all know the great commandment: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And honestly, growing up, having read this hundreds, thousands of however many times, I think I honestly lumped the heart, the soul, and the mind into one thing and really didn't distinguish, for example, the heart from the mind. But there's a reason why Jesus separated those two. And we'll talk about the elements of faith here in a second. But there is a difference between the heart part of your faith and the mind part of your faith, and they're both essential. And I guess what I was discovering was that the heart part of my faith was strong. It had never been shaken, but the mind part of my faith had never really been developed. And I just didn't understand what it was. And here I was late in life discovering this. Now, maybe I'm telling you guys all stuff that you already know. So if so, bear with me. But one of the first books that we were required to read at Denver Seminary was J.P. Moreland's Love Your God with All Your Mind, The Role of Reason in the Life of the Soul. And I devoured that book, and today I still go back and read it. Um, Again, reinforcing the whole notion of where the intellectual component fits into one's faith. So speaking of faith, you all may be familiar with this, but I'll run through it fairly quickly. But there are three elements of one's faith. There's the knowledge component, or the Latin word notitia. Knowledge is, what is it that we actually believe in? Um, any faith has to start there. What is it that you believe in? So that's number one. Number two is assent, or the Latin word assensus, means that you believe that that knowledge is true. You've accepted that intellectually. Now, that's clearly not enough, because the demons, as we know, knew who Jesus was, and they understood the truth, his truth, and the truth of Christianity, but obviously they're not believers. But this, to me, is the mind, or the intellectual component of one's faith. So that's where the mind takes ownership, or that the key component of faith. But then, as we all know, there's got to be this heartfelt belief or trust or commitment. You know that this set of beliefs, this knowledge that you have of your faith, you know that it's true, so much so that you've now committed your life to it, and it has changed your life. And that's the heart component of the faith. So when I get to put all this together, I'm thinking to myself, okay, now I'm getting my arms around faith, and in turn beginning to understand how I can articulate it, particularly to non-believers who, by definition, do not have number three. If someone's a non-believer, they do not have a heartfelt belief or trust. Why? Because the Holy Spirit has not regenerated their heart, their soul. So maybe what we have to do with many non-believers is to argue from a knowledge and assent perspective, and at least convince them that if they don't buy the fact that Christianity and the worldview is true, that it is highly, highly plausible, and that there is evidence and there is a rational basis for Christianity. Now, unfortunately, the Richard Dawkins of the world have been telling us, and young people still believe it today, that there is no basis for the Christian faith. We have a blind faith. In fact, I think he's been quoted as saying that Christians drive to church on Sunday morning, park their car, leave their minds in the car, and walk into the church. Now, to his credit, I could see where he could view that. He could have that view of Christians, because I don't think Christians, and certainly I'm one of them, as of 10 years ago at least, who could not talk of my faith in a way outside of special revelation that non-believers could relate to. And again, all of this is coming to the forefront of my faith, and I'm thinking, can I translate this into a way to talk to my son and other non-believers like him? So let me just close this part with a quote from J.P. Moreland, the author of the book. The spiritual journey is certainly more than loving God with our minds, but just as surely that journey is at least a life of intellectual devotion. Apologetics prepares the mind, the gospel pierces the heart. So Richard Dawkins, this is not a blind faith. This is a saving faith. Series of God things continue to happen. So I'm sitting in my introduction to apologetics class at the Denver Seminary, and the third assignment from Doug Grotice, the professor, longtime apologist, he says, I want everyone here in my class to go out and talk to a non-believer and have a worldview discussion, draw out that non-believer's worldview, and write a paper on it. Now, we had been talking about worldviews in his class. I'd obviously read The Universe Next Door, but I remember thinking, whoa, I'm not sure I know how to do that. But I think I know what he wants us to do. He wants to go to a coffee shop, for example, and pull up a chair with a stranger and have some sort of worldview discussion. But as you can imagine, I knew exactly who I wanted to talk to. Yes, I wanted to talk to my son. He was going to be the non-believer that I was going to talk to. And I was thinking to myself, maybe I ought to ask the professor if that's okay. And then I thought, I'd rather ask for forgiveness than permission, because I don't care what the professor says. I'm here largely because of my son, and he's the one I want to talk to. And God appears to be giving me an opportunity to do something that may turn out to be invaluable for him and maybe even me. So I called up my son, and he was living with his fiancee in the great Christian Mecca of San Francisco. I say that obviously rhetorically. He was living in a city where there's very little Christianity, and so here he had walked away from his faith and probably didn't have many Christians around him, which turned out to be the case. He was engaged to a woman that we knew very little about, but I assumed that she was not a Christian either. So I called him up and we had a good relationship. And I said, "Hey, Byron, can you help Dad with his homework?" And he laughed and he said, "Sure, Dad." And now he knew I was in seminary. And I said, "Well, here's the deal. Here's the assignment I got in my class." And I explained it to him. And I said, "Can you be that person? Can you be that non-believer that we have this world discussion about?" And he goes, "Sure. What's a worldview?" Well, the guilt comes back over me again because, again, if I had known about apologetics, had made that part of his religious education, he would have known what a worldview was a long time ago. But I said to him, "Well, I said, I won't give you a technical definition, but a worldview is really nothing more than a set of beliefs that you have, underlying beliefs that you may or may not be even aware of or fully aware of, that causes you to see this world in a certain way." And what I mean by that is you see this world, and you may hold the social positions, the moral positions, maybe even the political positions that you have really emanate from these underlying beliefs. And my son says to me, "Wow, I ought to know what those underlying beliefs are. Let's have that conversation." And I was taken aback. I thought, wow, did I just, he didn't say no. The wall didn't go up. Of course, I hadn't mentioned any of those four words, Jesus, God, Bible, and gospel, but he wanted to talk about worldviews. And I said, okay. Then I got bold and I said, well, how about your fiance? Keely is her name. I said, "Do you think she'd like to be part of this conversation?" And he goes, "Oh, sure, Dad." And I said, "Well, wait a minute." I said, "You guys are engaged. She's going to be my daughter-in-law, but I don't know her very well. She doesn't know me very well. And while I don't know what the questions are yet that I'm going to ask you, these are going to be pretty deep questions and personal. And if she's not comfortable with me, please don't push her into this." He goes, "Don't worry about it, Dad. She'll be part of the conversation." She said, "Okay." I said, "Well, give me a little bit of time to figure out how I'm going to do this, and then we'll talk." So I don't know, a couple weeks later, um, we FaceTimed, and this was before Zoom was out there. So we were FaceTiming, but the reality was the FaceTime was very helpful because, while obviously it would have been better face to face, but he was in San Francisco and I'm, in Colorado. But I could actually see them. So we were going to have a discussion that I could not only hear what they had to say, but I could watch them. And the body language in this discussion turned out to be very important. And I'll tell you why. Um, so I said to them, "All right, the guys, this is what we're going to do." I said, "We're gonna have this conversation, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions, about three levels of questions, and it'll get increasingly deeper. But I said a couple of ground rules. Number one is, if I ask you a question that for whatever reason you don't want to answer, that's fine. I just appreciate your willingness to talk to me." And then I said something that I didn't realize till later was absolutely critical. I said to them, and I said, "Look, I'm here to listen. And you answer these questions, and I'm not going to challenge you on anything. I'm going to take a lot of notes. I got to write a paper, but you're just free to talk to me." Now, looking back, I think that took the weight off my son's shoulders because, frankly, we had had a lot of discussions in the past and dad had pushed back very often. And he knew, wow, in this particular case, he could just talk and not worry about dad pushing back. So I probably learned a whole lot more than if I had not had that ground rule. So we started out, and I asked what I later called the church question. And if you've talked to a non-believer, you've just met somebody, and you begin to have some sort of spiritual discussion, you probably will get to the point at some point early on and ask them if they ever went to church. And typically, when you ask someone here in the United States who's not a believer, there's someone like my son, um, they'd probably say something like, "Well, yeah, I was raised, and we went to church, and I got nothing out of it. And as soon as I went off to college, I walked away from my faith, like apparently upwards of 70% of kids raised in Christian households do. They go to college and they walk away from their faith. An astonishing statistic, but I've seen that offered up in many different settings. But that's kind of the answer that I expected. Now, I didn't ask my son this question because I knew my son's background. So I asked that question of Keely. So that's what I expected to hear from her. I mean, but she didn't answer me that way. She stunned me in her answer. She said, "I've never been in a church." Well, I was surprised. I said, "Do you have any Christian friends?" She said, "I don't know, maybe." I said, "Have you ever had any problems with Christians?" She goes, "Not that I know of." Basically, Christianity was not even on her radar screen. Now, here I have my son who's made a conscious decision to walk away from his faith, and he's got some serious objections and hostility there. And I later in my paper called him a first generation non-believer. But I suspect that Keely is a second or third generation believer. And what I mean by that is perhaps her parents grew up in Christian homes and, like my son, walked away from their faith, got married, and then raised their daughter in a non-spiritual environment with no exposure whatsoever to certainly Christianity or perhaps anything spiritual. The good news there, though, was that as it became evident, she didn't hold the same hostility or have any of the basic objections about Christianity that my son had. So the good news there is that perhaps the second and third generation people are potentially more open to having discussions about faith in God than a first generation non-believer. Anyway, one of the hypotheses that I drew on my paper. So we continued. I said, "All right, guys, the next level of questions." And I asked them a series of questions about controversial issues, about abortion, about gay marriage, about homosexuality, about war and morality, and a whole bunch of stuff. And I told them, I said, "Look, how you answer these questions will not define your worldview, but they'll be windows into those underlying beliefs that we want to figure out are. Those underlying beliefs are causing you to answer these questions the way you're answering." Now, this was maybe the hardest part of our discussion because if you were to put my son and my daughter-in-law, who's now my daughter-in-law, on a political scale from conservative to liberal, they're way at the liberal end. Okay, so the way they answered these controversial questions, all I could do was bite my tongue and bite my lips and not respond because I made that promise. But again, it was revealing, and they felt free to answer the way they did. So we get through that, and I said, "Okay, now we're down to I'm gonna pose 5 questions to you that how you answer these questions will define your worldview." And I said, let me step through those, and then we'll come back and you each take turns answering them. And here are the ones that I offered up to them. I call them the humanity big life questions. Origin, where do we humans come from? Identity, who are we? Are we unique or are we just one step beyond the chimpanzee, for example? Meaning, is there any meaning to life? And if so, what is it? Why are we here? Morality, what's right? What's wrong? Why is something right? And why is something wrong? And lastly, destination. Where are we humans headed? Now, there are other big life questions. For example, I didn't want to get into all of them because this was going to be a deep enough discussion as it was. These were sufficient for my purposes, but other questions big life questions include the problem of evil and suffering. You know, Christians and atheists all agree, and probably every worldview agrees, that there is evil and suffering in this world. The question then becomes, is it solvable? And if it's solvable, how is it solvable? And when might it be solved? As you can imagine, we Christians have an answer for that. Atheists, not so much. That's another big life question. Another one is, do we humans have free will, or is everything deterministic in our life? So anyway, there are a host of big life questions that every worldview should have an answer for. And that's what I was getting at here with these five. So I circle back up to the front, and I won't walk through all of this. I want to be um, respectful of your time, but I'll just share the first and the last question with you because it's very revealing and helped me in my approach to evangelism. So the first question I asked, as I said, okay, the origin question. I said, Keely, let me start with you. Now, what word do you think would come out of someone's mouth who's been raised in the public school system about where do humans come from? Yes, the word evolution, right? You would expect that to be the answer. And so when I turned to her, that was the fifth word out of her mouth. Well, we're evolved. And she went on talking about that. Now, again, you know, I couldn't push back. I couldn't challenge her, and she said, because she really wasn't answering the question. Because evolution, as you well know, assumes life. And then if you believe in evolution, then life evolves from that initial life source. The question really is, where does life become from to start with? And of course, evolution can't explain the origin of life. But, I let it go. She said evolution. So I certainly expected my son to say the same thing, but he didn't. So I said, Byron, how do you answer that question? And I don't know whether on the spot he thought of this or whether he had been preparing for this discussion or not. He pauses and he said, well, he says, I know the majority of scientists in this world, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, believe that the Big Bang is the origin of the universe. Now, he's going way back, but I'm thinking, where is he going with this? You know, because I assumed he was an atheist, although that was going to be confirmed throughout this discussion, but I assumed he was. And as you well know, atheists oftentimes, usually point to science as a source of truth, and maybe the only source of truth. And here he was pointing out science, but pointing out an aspect of science, the standard cosmological model, that said that there's a beginning to the universe. And obviously, the implications are that, okay, there's something before that that isn't physical and precedes science as we know it. And I'm thinking, where is he going with this? And then as I teach in class, he says to me, but I don't believe it. I believe the universe has been here eternally. And my jaw dropped, right? Now, again, I couldn't challenge him. I mean, I wanted to say to him, okay, so you don't believe the science. So what is it about the general theory of relativity, which is really at the core of the Big Bang theory? What about the redshift data that Hubble discovered and showed to Einstein, which showed that the universe was expanding? What about the heat source in the universe that Penzias and Wilson found and got a Nobel Prize for? I wanted to throw this stuff out and challenge him why he wouldn't believe this, what scientifically wouldn't believe. But the point here is that it was not the science that he was objecting to, it was his worldview. The worldview trumps the science for atheists when the science appears to point towards God. Then they fall back on their worldview. So he was rejecting a well-accepted scientific theory, not based on science, based on his worldview, because he knew that if he accepted that, then that left something non-physical, and there had to be a source, and the implication was that maybe there was a God that was the source of this universe. I was just amazed. So he had done some thinking on this. We worked through these questions, and it was just a wonderful discussion. Meaning, they struggled with the meaning question because, frankly, if you're an atheist, there is no meaning or purpose to the universe. It's all up to the individual. But let me jump to the last question, and that's the destination question. By the time we got to it, we had been talking for 2 hours. It was just amazing, and it had never dragged. They were totally into this discussion. Um, so we got to this last question, and I said, "All right, destination. Byron, how do you answer this question? Where are we headed? Where are we going?" And he says to me, "Dad, what do you mean by that?" And I said, "Well, let's not talk about the human race. Let's just talk about you." I said, "When you die, what's going to happen?" And he says, "Oh, that's easy. I'm just a bunch of chemicals and molecules. That's all I am. And when I'm dead, and I'm okay with that." Now, the reality is that that was entirely consistent with everything he'd told me up to that point. He was a naturalist. He was a materialist. He was an atheist. Didn't believe in God, didn't believe in anything non-physical. And so in his mind, he all he is chemicals and molecules. And if that's true, when you die, that's the end of you as a person. So I wasn't surprised. And I was about to turn to Keely and ask her that question when I believe the Holy Spirit whispered in my ear and said, "Go off script now." And I looked at the two of them and I said, "Byron, Keely," I said, "you guys are clearly in love. And Keely, we're going to welcome you into the family. But Byron, you just told me that you're just chemicals and molecules. So how do you explain that love, which is so evident between the two of you?" And without skipping a beat, he says, "Oh, love is just an emergent property of chemical molecules." Now, again, of course, he has no idea what emergent property means. He probably heard that someplace. But however you might define emergence in terms of the science, um, that's the only answer that you could give to explain love. It is something that evolves, must have evolved. There's no personal aspect to it. But when he said that, Keely's head turned immediately. And in a sense, her jaw dropped. She looked at him like, "What did you say?" I mean, she didn't say that, but that was the expression on her face. And why? Well, the reality is, if I had asked her that question first before Byron, she would have had to answer it in a similar way as him. Now, she probably wouldn't have been as blunt, but every indication at this point was she was a materialist, she was a naturalist, she was an atheist. And what else could she possibly say? But when she heard her fiance say that, she knew in her heart that's not right. So, I'm watching the two of them. Again, this is why being able to see the body language was very helpful. And I'm sort of backing up in my chair thinking, whoa, maybe she's not going to be my daughter-in-law. We can have a discussion about that. But in any case, the dust settled. And so I said, "All right, Keely, last question for you. How do you answer that question?" Now, I don't know for a fact if this is true, but I really suspect that her answer changed as a result of what her fiance said. Because when I said, "Keely, what happens to you? What's going to happen to you after you die?" She said, "Well, I don't know, but I think there's something out there, and I'm curious as to what that might be." Now, again, when I teach this stuff, that is huge, okay? Because if in fact she was an atheist when she walked in the door, she's walking out of the door and she's no longer an atheist because she now believes in something transcendent, something immaterial, potentially something spiritual, something that's beyond this physical world. And that's not a naturalist anymore. And when you talk to naturalists and non-believers like my son and her, if you can get them to now admit that there is something beyond this physical world, that is a first step towards eventually talking about God and eventually, hopefully, getting to the gospel. To conclude this, this was huge, I think, for them because, as Greg Koukl, and you may be familiar with Greg Koukl, wonderful apologist, often says, our goal oftentimes is very limited. Can we just put a pebble in their shoe? And I think I put a pebble in their shoe. And it's not because anything that I proposed. I never proposed Christianity. In fact, the four words never came up in the conversation. God, Christian, or God, Jesus, gospel, and Bible never came up. But I think they walked away from that conversation a whole lot less sure of their worldview than when it started. And it was just as a result of a series of questions. So that has turned out for me to be an approach that I often take when I talk to non-believers. First, I want to figure out what their worldview is. And then once I understand what their worldview is, just like Paul, then I better understand how to approach them. Because if they have a theistic worldview, if they're a Muslim or they're a Jew, we have a lot of common ground. We believe in a creator, a God, a sovereign God who created this universe. And so we have a basis upon which to have a discussion. If I'm talking to a pantheist or an atheist, or an Epicurean or a Stoicist like person, I got to take a very different approach. So I was learning a lot about evangelism in this respect. All right. Let me just let me conclude that portion of my apologetics journey with a quote that I forget who this is from. It's not me, but what seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. And Dawkins is a perfect example of that. I imagine he's spoken to so many Christians who were not able to defend what they believed in. And so he walked away with the conclusion that we have no basis for our faith. Now, on the other hand, I've had several of these worldview discussions with non-believers. They've always been positive, but none of them have ever said at the end of the conversation, "Oh, I believe in Jesus." So it's not sufficient. It's not enough. But oftentimes it's a necessary initial conversation to have. But again, if we can't defend our faith and if we don't justify our faith to our children, they will walk away when they go to college, like my son did. All right. Um, I guess in just the remaining few moments that we have, let me just quickly share the application. One of the applications of my apologetic journey was a discussion with my son, but it has turned into a ministry because my wife, I remember, asked me as I was getting close to completing my degree, she said, "What are you going to do with this? You spent a lot of your time and our money getting a degree. What are you going to do with it?" I said, "Well, I hope I can continue to teach in church, but I don't know. What does God have in store for me?" Within a month, I got this email from somebody who was just starting up. I didn't even know him. In fact, I don't know how he got my name, but he was also a Biola graduate, and he was just starting this ministry, which came to be known as Apologetics on Mission. And Yvonne, I know you're on our mailing list. I don't know if anybody else is as well, but this ministry has grown over the last 4 years. And let me just share with you a little bit here. Um, being an analytical person, me and my partner, he's a former high tech guy, had his own business, electrical engineer, Ben Clifton, he's the president. We said, all right, if we're going to start this ministry, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And this is how we articulate it. Outside the West, God, for whatever reason, has us working outside the US, outside the West, frankly, where most of the Christians are in the world, in Africa and Asia and South America. But outside the West, there is a lack of awareness and training in defending the Christian faith, i.e., a lack of awareness of apologetics, which is leaving the church with a capital C unprepared to resist all of these non-Christian, non-biblical worldviews. Okay. Now, we've been asked, well, we got a big problem in the US, as your son is evident of. Why don't you focus on the US? And the answer, number one, is God appears to have led us to work outside the US, but also there are many good apologetic ministries like RTB, Reasonable Faith, and many others whose focus really is in the United States. But there is almost no one apologetically working in the rest of the world. It is very, very limited. RTB, Hugh Ross will go overseas and he'll give a talk and then come home. Um, William Lane Craig will go overseas in Africa, give a talk and come home. And we felt that's not good enough. We want to go work with people. And we want to develop, go beyond just awareness and train people who can carry on with apologetics. Here's one of the few apologists in Africa, Ebenezer Afolabi, says there's two glaring problems in Africa in the Christian faith: lack of awareness and little access to apologetics training. What's our solution? Ignite awareness through training, equipping, and discipleship of leaders in order to engage the next generation. Our focus is to train the trainers. I mean, there's no way that we as a small ministry, even if we were a large ministry, could go to many churches in Africa and South America and Asia and begin to share apologetics at the church level. No, what we need to do is identify the leaders and train the leaders. And they, in turn, contextualize apologetics in their culture, in their language, and they do the training in the church or wherever. Um, Here's a good friend of mine, a Brazilian pastor, where in Brazil, the evangelical church is growing rapidly, but they know nothing about apologetics. And here he says, our younger generation needs it. Well, he didn't make that statement until after we introduced apologetics to him. He told me that he says, I'm part of a church that 20 years ago was 500 people. We now have over 20,000 members and 7 different campuses. And I said, that's amazing. I said, yeah. He said, we're growing rapidly. I said, well, you're doing something right. Tell me what you're doing. He says, yeah, but he says, while we are growing rapidly, we are rapidly losing young folks. These teenagers are walking away. And that's when I said to him, do you know anything about apologetics? And he said, no. And 2 months later, he had us down in Brazil teaching his pastors apologetics. What's the outcome? Well, we hope to leave behind global communities of leaders mobilized to, as Jude 3 says, contend for the faith in Jesus Christ and empower the next generation to do the same. And not only do we go on short-term missions, but we teach an introduction to apologetics in between missions to those people that we're building relationships with. So here on the left is, I think, our second class of graduates out of Uganda. All of them here, amazingly, are either at the time were medical students, nurses, or pharmacists, very bright in a Ugandan medical school, true Christians, young people that the pastor had identified as future leaders. And they are, in fact, the core of what's now an apologetic ministry in Uganda called Apologetics Uganda, which has spread rapidly throughout Uganda as these medical students graduate and the government assigns them to hospitals around the country. They take their apologetics with them, and now they're out speaking at seminaries, at churches, in public schools, and universities. Amazing. On the right are those pastors and lay leaders that we taught in Brazil as a result of them learning about apologetics. Quickly, a few photos of where we've been. That's Ben and myself in Kenya. We were at a university, St. Paul's University in Kenya, a wonderful school, no apologetics program. And we were there to sell them on developing an apologetics program, and they're going to do that. They're getting close to having it. That's me holding up the universe next door, speaking to the faculty of the African Renewal University in Kampala. That's Ben and I at the Global Military Christian um, Conference in Brazil. We met the Taiwan delegation, and now we're working in Taiwan. A couple pictures from Brazil. Oftentimes, when we go and share our apologetics ministry, we often are asked to preach. And I remember the first time I was asked to preach, not being ordained in my church, my gut reaction was to say, no, I'm not qualified to do that. Well, they don't have the same kind of stringent qualifications in other countries. And so I end up once in a while preaching. And this is at one of these large Brazilian churches. And yes, guess what I preached on? Paul in Athens. So I tried to stay in my lane, in the apologetics lane. In the upper right is a young couple who approached me after my sermon, two medical students in Brazil, and they came up to me and they said, we are overwhelmed in the university system here in Brazil, which is increasingly atheistic. and our faith is put down, and we just don't know how to defend it. And what you told us today was that there is a significant intellectual component to our faith, and we're going to learn what it is. And apologetics is now on the top of our priority list in learning. They were so grateful to learn of it. This is me in Honduras, or that's El Salvador, I think. Um, Given my military background, I am now shifting my emphasis in this ministry to partnering with global Christian military ministries that, as you might suspect, are ministering to Christians in military or first responder organizations around the world. And there are a number of global ministries doing this. But guess what? They're missing the apologetic component. And given my, many 33 years in the military, my prior rank, I get doors open for me to speak to soldiers. We went to Honduras and were told that we would get to speak to the Christian soldiers who voluntarily would come out to meet us. Instead, they marched an entire military police battalion, which obviously couldn't be all Christians. And suddenly I had to change my whole talk on the spot and talk to a combination of Christians and non-Christians. Um, but a wonderful opportunity. We not only work in Eastern Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, we're now working in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and about 6 other countries down there. This was us at Brazil at this global military conference. 2 chaplains approached us after we had had an apologetic session. One is a Nigerian Air Force captain, and the other one is a Ugandan Army lieutenant. And they had sat through our apologetic sessions and came up and asked if they could take our course. And that has now turned into be my focus. Remember, we want to identify global leaders who can then in turn contextualize and teach those that they are leading. Well, what better group of leaders than chaplains who have a legal authority, leadership authority, and have soldiers underneath them? If I could train them in apologetics and give them another tool in their tool bag, they could potentially use that when ministering to their soldiers. So that's what I'm doing now. These are the Ugandan leaders in apologetics Uganda. International chaplain training, I'm now involved in that. And I was asked to speak to all the Nigerian Protestant chaplains by Zoom and give an introduction to apologetics. And this was a picture they sent me of them standing up and saying, thank you for Zooming in and speaking to them. Real quick, I told you we offer a course, Introduction to Apologetics. And as you can see down the right-hand side, those topics that are eye-opening to me. We talk about truth, worldviews, the problem of evil, the apologetics of Jesus, and as you might suspect, scientific arguments for theism. We borrow much from the RTB material, philosophical arguments, and so forth. So probably overused my time. I apologize, but that's the sum total of my journey here over the last 12 years or so. It has been a joy. My other 2 careers, I was serving our country, the military, and through the Department of Energy, serving my country in both of those roles. But there is no greater joy than to serve the Lord more directly and take what the Lord has taught me and the experiences that He's given me and apply it in a whole new setting. If somebody had asked me or told me 10 years ago that I would be in ministry, that was not on my horizon. Couldn't imagine any such thing. And yet that's what I'm doing. And so that concludes my talk. I guess I'll turn it back over to you guys and any questions that you might have regarding apologetics or my experiences or how we might be able to help you guys. But thanks again for the opportunity.
Hang on, Doug. We're going to pass the phone to anyone that has a question.
Okay.
And I told you about Sid Vogel, West Point, New Mexico. What class, Sid?
75. Virgin Drive, 75.
I turned it away.
75, you said?
75.
Yeah, you graduated just before we walked in the door. I was class of 79.
You're class 79, right?
Yeah. You said 75?
75, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you
Yep.
happen to know Bill Baratino, who is in the Air Force, but he's class 75, he graduated with me at the military academy, went into the Air Force and spent almost all of his career at Kirkland at Sandia Labs. And
Oh, he did, really? No, no, I don't know him. But like him, I guess I had a classmate. I have a classmate who did his 5 years in the Army and became a reservist and transferred to the Navy and ended up retiring as a Navy captain. So that happens once in a while. Of course, we hold it against him when the Army Navy game comes around, but I don't know who he roots for.
Anybody? Anybody?
The name of his two sons again.
The name of your two sons again?
Byron, and the other one is Davis, Davis. Yeah.
did you attend chapel at the military academy? When I was there, we had mandatory chapel our first 2 years.
Right.
And after that, it obviously disappeared.
It disappeared.
I'm
Yeah.
sure at the military academy.
Yeah, no, sporadically. But there's an amazing story behind that. So when I entered the academy, of course, they knew our denomination, and so they pointed us towards, whether you were Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, to attend chapel on Sunday mornings. And the head of the one of the Protestant chaplains was Colin Kelly. Now, if you know your history, Colin Kelly Sr. was part of the response to Pearl Harbor and the bombing of Japan. And he was killed in that mission, and his son was born shortly after he was killed, Colin Kelly Jr. And Colin Kelly Jr. Will tell you that President Roosevelt got up on the radio after this mission to bomb Japan had occurred, and he was talking about all the brave Army airmen that had been in the mission, and specifically pointed out Colin Kelly Sr. And he said, because of that, Colin Kelly Jr., who was only like 2 months old or something at that point, is guaranteed admission to West Point. Now, Colin Kelly will tell you that that was a huge, huge burden on him because he said, I had to spend my life convincing people that I could have gotten into West Point anyway. And he said, I didn't necessarily want to go to West Point, but it was determined that's where I was going to go. And he said, I felt I had to prove to others that I could have gotten in without President Roosevelt guaranteeing that I could go. But he was the Protestant chaplain at West Point when I showed up there. Now, I did not attend chapel faithfully. And so fast forward the 13 years I spent in the service, I get out, I went to work at Los Alamos National Lab, and I go to my church in Los Alamos, and guess who the pastor is in that church? It's Colin Kelly Jr. So I looked at my wife and I told her the story. I said, but he's no way he's going to remember me because I didn't go to chapel enough. So as we're leaving the church, he walks up, shakes my hand, and he says, Doug, how have you been? And I was stunned. Not only did he remember me, he remembered my name. And I said, Colin, how the heck do you remember me? He goes, well, Doug, I had a printout of all the denominational, the ones in our denomination. Again, I'm not pointing out what it is. And I knew who you were. And you remember, I used to go around to the barracks. So when you didn't show up at chapel, I'd knock on your door once in a while, and I knew who you were. I said, wow. So I quickly got involved in the church and started volunteering for everything. And I told Colin, I'm going to try to make up for those 4 years that I was not a very good chapel attender. So an amazing story in that both his story and then meeting him some 13 years later.
Wow.
I understand all of you or most of you are either doctors or engineers. Is that largely the case? And of course, we got at least one military person there in the crowd as well.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Doctors, engineers, you stockbrokers.
And that would explain your interest in reasons to believe, science apologetics. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We heard Bill Clifton spoke to us, I think, a year ago. I didn't realize your organization was with him. Ben Clifton.
I'm having trouble understanding. I can hear you, but it's not clear.
Yeah, Ben Clifton. I didn't realize y'all were together.
Yes.
'Cause he spoke to our group over a year ago,
Okay.
and he was working for a while there at Reasons to Believe and doing a real good job. In fact, nobody has replaced him. So I didn't realize that y'all were linked up together.
Yes, yes. And yeah, he was I guess, the national chapter leader for RTB. That was his role, and he loved it. But he was told that because of a shortage of funds and having to establish tighter priorities, that there would be a whole lot less emphasis within RTB on supporting chapters, and they weren't going to fund his position any longer. And so he came back full time with us. And actually, he's excited to hear that there are still RTB chapters out there that are still, because he got the impression that the RTB chapters just may disappear without any kind of
Well,
support from RTB.
well,
So,
that's funny because they kind of said, just dissolve yourselves. And I just kind of kept it going.
yeah,
I mean, it was no big deal, right? I mean, our only presence is on Facebook. But I said, heck, I'll just kind of keep it for now. And then suddenly they turned around. It seems like Fuzz said, no, I want to keep it. So they brought it all back in, which I think it was a shame because, a couple of them, like Austin, had the biggest one in the country, and they turned over to a Reasonable Faith chapter after that.
wow.
So, I don't know why they gave it up. Anyway, I mean, they were fairly autonomous anyway. But,
I
you
think
know,
it was
that,
a board decision that surprised a lot of folks.
yeah,
And so it wasn't a Hugh Ross or a Fuzz decision. It was a board of directors decision, I think, which was not well received within RTB. Yeah.
well, in any event, that question with your future daughter-in-law about the whole purpose of everything. I don't know if you remember watching Richard Dawkins debate John Lennox in Birmingham. It must have been 15 years ago.
Okay.
And, Richard Dawkins was trying to convince him that there is no such thing as faith or belief in anything. And Lennox bent over there. He said, Richard, you do believe in your wife, don't you? Oh, and everyone busted out laughing. What are you going to say? No, I don't believe in her. He
Yeah.
destroyed her.
Yeah, the good news is that atheism, certainly neo-Darwinism, is disappearing. I think intellectually it's been so discredited. And
Yeah.
so you see a lot of books coming out and apologists talking about how the young people are walking away from atheism. Now, they're not walking to Christianity per se, but they're at least asking spiritual questions. And, my other daughter-in-law, she will tell you that she's spiritual. And, I have to always prevent, not to smile when I hear that, because as soon as someone says they're spiritual, the first question you should ask is, well, what do you mean by that? And the answers that you get to that question are sometimes unbelievable. Their notion of spirituality can be anything in the world, but it's not atheism.
Let me ask you, you're working with the militaries overseas in some of these third world countries and whatnot. How about working with the militaries at the military academies? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. Is there any kind of apologetics going on, training? I would think that would attract people up the hill. You know what I mean? At
Yeah,
West Point, you got
yeah.
to get up the hill to go to church. I would think that apologetics would attract a lot of people up the hill.
I agree with you. And I guess I can't say for sure if that any of that is happening. I will say though that the military Christian military ministries that I'm working with include OCF, Officers Christian Fellowship. Okay, now Officers Christian Fellowship's focus is on U.S. military, so we don't partner with them a whole lot because our focus is non-U.S. But I do know that West Point has for a long time had an OCF chapter. I think they're actually lacking a leader right now. But I would bet given my experience with Christians in this country, and my knowledge of OCF in general, that there is little to no discussion of apologetics. And so I do know the president of OCF. He's a retired Air Force colonel. He lives here in Colorado Springs, and we've had discussions. And I said, we have got to get apologetics into OCF. I said, I don't know that we're the right ministry because our focus is not there. And in general, he agrees with me. Whether he's doing anything, I don't know. Now, the other ministries that we're working with, one is the Association of Military Christian Fellowships, which is comprised of Christians in the military and first responders in 154 countries. And it's headed up by a retired two-star Filipino general. And that picture I showed you of us with the Taiwan delegation was in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where they were holding their 10-year global conference, and where I think not 154 countries, but upwards of 100 countries were represented and people came in. So there is a couple of ministries that focus on working with these Christians in their military settings. And another ministry that we discovered as a result of this world conference in Brazil, there's a ministry called the International Association of Evangelical Chaplains. And it's comprised of retired U.S. military chaplains, Navy captains, Army colonels. The head of the board of directors for this organization is a retired one-star Army former chaplain. And their focus is specifically on chaplains in other countries, or where there are a number of ministry or militaries that do not have a chaplaincy. And so their goal is to help establish chaplaincies. But as I quickly discovered, in all of their chaplain training, there was no apologetic component. So, being a retired flag officer, I volunteered to be the required flag officer at their chaplain's training. And I said, I'll be your guy and I'll help you teach professional ethics and Christian ethics and whatnot, but you got to give me an opportunity to speak about apologetics. So I think I've now got a 90-minute class on apologetics embedded in their chaplain's training. So the next step is actually take it on the road and go to other countries and teach it, like I did those Nigerian chaplains by Zoom. So.
I don't want to occupy all your time here, but I'll just give you one example. When Desert Shield happened, I took the advanced party of combat engineers into Saudi Arabia, and there in our areas, the Saudis required us to allow them to establish a tent that the imams could approach American GIs and bring them in and evangelize American soldiers. And I didn't even know about apologetics at that time. I went and sat in the tent. I wanted to hear what they were saying. Yeah. They were brilliant people. These were guys that graduated from Yale and Harvard and whatnot. And they knew the American system. They knew the American culture. They knew the Christian religion, and they could really defeat American kids in a heartbeat, in a heartbeat. And in fact, at one point in time after the conflict was over, they had COSCOM, the COSCOM commander, agree to have a meeting and bring all of the senior officers and senior NCOs in and listen to their people preach about Islam to our folks. It was unbelievable. And I still never heard anything about apologetics at that point in time. But somehow it seems to me it needs to be a component inside the American military that is outreach to our own people.
Yeah. Well,
anyway, that's my experience.
Yeah, no, it's amazing to hear about this exposure to Islam and opening the doors. And yet all of our chaplains across the military have all kinds of constraints on them on what they can do and how they can evangelize and things like that, yet opening the door to the Muslims. But I'm having lots of discussions with these retired chaplains, and my goal is that most of these chaplains know about apologetics, but it's not part of what they do. Now, when I went to Denver Seminary, there were a few of us studying apologetics. The vast majority of the people there, the younger folks there, certainly younger than me, were studying to be pastors. And if the Denver Seminary and Biola's Talbot School of Theology are representative of seminaries across the U.S., if they are, this is the apologetics exposure that they get. They have a 3-year, very intense master's program, Masters of Divinity, and they study Old Testament, New Testament, systematic theology, Greek, Hebrew, counseling, all this stuff, all wonderful stuff. They get one introduction to apologetics. So, given that, it's no wonder to me that the pastors that we have here in the U.S. probably know something about apologetics, but do not have a foundation enough
Yeah.
to teach it. So, if I was in charge of all churches, and a church was large enough to have 2 pastors, I would say the head pastor should be the one with the MDiv and have that firm biblical foundation and limited apologetics. But the second pastor should be a youth pastor who has a degree in apologetics. Firm basis in the Bible, of course, but a focus on apologetics. You put those two together, and we could make a difference. But I'm not in charge. So.
You know, you look at the Apostle Paul, who got his training under Gamaliel in Tarsus, where it was a Greek and Hebrew training. I mean, he was steeped in apologetics, basically. They just didn't call it that.
That's right.
And then you saw him go up to what he met up at Mars Hill, which is about a 12 by 12 area. He defeated the top Greek scholars, and they kind of got frustrated and said, pointed out the smaller hill down there, which was basically, the district courts. So you talk to them about it after he blew them up. I mean, he walks in there and says, I can see you're very religious. You even have a statue to the unknown God. And now I'm going to teach you about who this unknown God is. I mean, they must have fallen down out of their chair.
And of course, Luke always has to summarize whatever Paul said, but you imagine he was probably up there for a couple of hours. And boy,
Yeah.
if we could have heard that discussion, that would have been absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we sure do. Did anyone else have any questions? I think we're all good there, and we surely appreciate your time with us.
Well, I enjoyed it, and I'm glad to hear that my partner Ben and I are just we're the 2 co-founders of Apologetics on Mission, and what a joy it is to work with him. And frankly, I'm glad he's not working part-time for RTB, so he can give us 100% of his time. Sorry about that.
He was very efficient when he worked for RTB, and I didn't realize he'd been out of it for almost a year. When I said, well, "Ben, where you been?" Because I'm no longer there. I don't know, because he was answering the questions that nobody else would answer. But anyway, so he did a great job. Again, we really thank you for your time, and I'll catch up with you by email on some questions I have.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. God bless.
Thanks, Doug.
Bye-bye.
That was good.